On the other side of toxic Christianity, I found myself faced with one question. Now what? This podcast is about that question. We have conversations with folks who are asking themselves the same things. We're picking up the pieces of a fractured and fragmented faith. We're finding treasure in what the church called trash, beauty and solidarity in people and places we were told to fear, reject, and dismiss. I'm Tammy Spencer Helms, and this is Life After 11. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to this episode of Life After 11. I'm your host, Tammy Spencer Helms, and I'm joined by almost Dr. Luther Young. Almost doctor. And I had the opportunity to hear Luther speak at an organization called QCF, which is for Queer Christians, Queer Christian Fellowship. And he spoke about a lot of his work and what he's doing his doctoral work on. And so I'm going to have Luther just talk to us about what he's working on, why it matters, and what we can take from that. But first, I would love to have you introduce yourself and tell us who you are, where you're from, what you do.
Thank you so much, Tamis, for having me. It's so grateful to be here with you and for folks who are out there listening. So I am Luther Young. My pronouns are he, him. As Tamis mentioned, I am currently a PhD candidate, almost doctor, in sociology at The Ohio State University. Yes. And my work does, which I'll talk about in a second, bridge intersections of race and gender and sexuality. But I am an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I currently serve as the council moderator for the Disciples LGBTQ+ Alliance for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. I also serve as a board member for Q Christian Fellowship, as Tamis mentioned a moment ago. I spend most of my time in Chicago, Illinois. That is kind of my home base for the time being. Originally from South Carolina, moved around the South and made my way to the Midwest to Columbus for graduate school, and then Chicago and some other places. I grew up in the Pentecostal church, the Holiness church to be exact. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that in this episode. But still very much Pentecostal down in my bones, even though I am currently a disciple. And so that is a little bit about who I am.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So we ask every guest, this podcast is called Life After 11, and we're referring to 11 as any sort of toxic infiltration in our faith walk that we had to extract and walk away from. So for you, what was life like before and after you unleavened?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I grew up in the Holiness Church, and I did not realize the impact that had on me until much later in life. At the time, it was all I knew. And I grew up in church. I'm pretty sure I was in church since birth. I'm pretty sure if there was a revival happening the day I was born, my mother may have taken me to church that night. So it was just, church has always been something that's been a part of me. Plenty of preachers in my family. My great-grandmother was a minister. My grandmother was a mother in the church. Plenty of uncles and aunts and cousins who are all, bishops and apostles and pastors, evangelists, prophetess, and all these whole family full of, I'm telling you. I also got a whole... Well, I got a whole family full of hellions too, so I think there's balance.
Speaking of intersectionality, right?
Telling you. Yeah. But I was very involved in church ever since I was a young kid. I started playing music in church when I was really young. My father is a musician. He taught me how to play drums when I was about 5. So I was playing drums in the church, and eventually learned to play piano, keys, organ. And so I've been had done that since, I don't know, age 13 or so. I got my first job at a church that was not my home church, leading music and those sorts of things at age 15. And so ever since then, I've been working in music ministry.
Wow.
And, church was just, we were there every Sunday. We were there, Monday night prayer, Wednesday night Bible study, Friday night service. If there was a revival, we were there all week. We're there all day Sunday because we had, Sunday school, morning service, stay, talk, eat, clean the church. have
Mm-hmm.
the Sunday evening service. Um, but the environment that I grew up in, to your question, was so restrictive.
Hmm.
And, everything was centered around what we couldn't do. So,
Mm-hmm.
you don't cuss, don't drink. Uh, women can't wear pants. Men can't have long hair. You can't wear short pants. You can't, go this place. I joke to this day that I can't skate because we weren't allowed to go to the skating rink as a
Wow.
kid
Yeah.
because the
Yeah.
skating rink plays secular music. And, we couldn't go
Mm-hmm.
down there if they played secular music. So all these things that we couldn't do, couldn't do, couldn't do, couldn't do, couldn't do. And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't realize later that all of those things had an impact on me, not just like unlearning that theology, but just deep down. So realizing in my, late 20s into my 30s, that some of that stuff had an impact on how I viewed myself. So realizing that I hate my body a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times because we were told as we were coming up in that faith tradition that the flesh is sinful, the body is
Yep.
bad, you got to bring your flesh under subjection, you got to die daily, and all of this kind of theology. And I
Indeed.
realized now I don't like myself. Wow.
Shocking.
Wow, therapy. I'm telling you, therapy, the things that you learn and unlearn. Um, and so I think that's probably the biggest thing is how restrictive that thing was. And then having this
Mm-hmm.
realization that, well, the scripture says, Jesus says that, the scripture says, who's the sun sets free is free indeed. Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it more abundantly. So not to be, constricting, repenting every 5 minutes. I stubbed my toe.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, bleep. Oh, now I ain't saved no more. Let me go back to the altar and repent. Um, that
Yeah.
just was not a life to live. And so that
Yeah.
is something that I definitely had to leave
Mm-hmm.
behind and embrace a more liberative theology, not an anything goes theology, because
Right.
I still believe holiness is right.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it, engaging in a theology that focuses on being free and not being
Mm-hmm.
bound.
Mm-hmm. That's really good. So you kind of basically you took off all of the shackles and left the core truths, right? Which I guess would lead you into a life that says I still actually want to walk uprightly in society. And I think that freedom actually it frees us to actually do that with a clear conscience. So I love that
Absolutely.
you brought that up, but I want to get to what you're studying. So talk to us a little
Yes.
bit about like it's a dissertation, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
talk to us a little bit about what you're writing about, what you're studying, what you're researching.
for sure. So uh, to give a 30-second backstory of how I got to the research question that I'm investigating, as I mentioned, I've worked in church my whole life.
Mhm,
When I was in seminary, I was working at a church. It was a missionary Baptist church. By that time, I had kind of deviated and tried out some other denominations.
mhm,
Was serving there in the music department. I was also the minister of young adults and an advisor to the youth. And
mhm,
while I was at that church, I came out. I put that in
mhm,
quotes because it wasn't a secret, but apparently people didn't
mhm.
know. So I was just like, "Hey, in case y'all didn't know, I like guys." Um, that didn't go so well, and I was unfortunately had to leave that church. And in
Mhm,
that period of discernment and figuring out like what are my next steps, what does ministry look like for me, I realized what I was passionate about was making sure that our churches were safer spaces for people and more inclusive,
mhm,
particularly when it comes to with issues of race and
mhm,
sexuality and gender. And so when
mhm,
I said, okay, this is the ministry that I want to do, let me look up some resources on how to do this, particularly in a Black church context. I found like
mhm.
2 books,
Yeah.
and that was it. And so it was
Mhm,
like, well, I guess somebody should go out here and develop these resources, and
mhm.
realizing that to adequately do that, someone has to go out and do the sociological work and asking the
Right.
questions of what is actually happening in our churches, what is actually happening in our communities, and how are those meeting up together. And so my research focuses on the intersections of race and gender and sexuality. So I'm particularly interested in how um, what are the possible causes and potential consequences of homophobia, transphobia, non affirmation of queer folks in Black church spaces.
Mhm,
And so what that has looked like is most of my work is qualitative, and so doing in-depth interviews with people, asking them, this is queer folks, straight folks, any folks, and just say, hey,
Mhm.
what is your experience with church? How has
Mhm.
that been? How does your church tackle these questions of gender and sexuality? What do
Mhm.
you think about that? How do you feel? And I've also, sat in churches and observed churches and kind of see like what is the theology that's coming across the pulpit? What
Mhm.
infrastructure do these churches have in place, if any, for queer people?
Mhm.
And thinking about what are the potential implications of that. So, right now, my current dissertation is a big question for that is why do queer Black folks tend to stay in or leave churches that are not affirming of their identities?
Mhm.
And what are the implications of that decision for them on their social well being, emotional well being, even their physical health? What are some aspects of that, right? Because someone could say, gosh, after my church kicked me out, I turned to harmful substances that completely
Right.
ruined my life, right?
Mhm.
So thinking about how all of these things are at play.
Yeah. So that is so interesting to me because I think about the legacy of Black church, and I'm wrestling because, I wrote this book about leaving white evangelicalism, growing up in Black church, being introduced to white evangelicalism, and then leaving that space after Trayvon died and realizing how
Mm,
much kind of white supremacy was embedded in everything. Um, but now that I'm actually fully walking out queerness, and, it's been interesting to have conversations about being in the Black church, because some might say, like, after the book, did you just go back to the Black church? It's kind of like, well, not quite, because I think what happens to the Black church when we lose that legacy of giving voice and dignity and value to the marginalized, right? Like in the face of this empire in which we live. And I wonder about that. Like, what are your thoughts about that? Like, if the Black church isn't affirming, does it lose its legacy of being sort of this voice in a wilderness of oppression, right? Like, I do believe that the trans issues right now is actually civil rights. We're in another civil rights movement, in my opinion. And so it's so hard to navigate like this rich history that formed us, but then actually there's a part of us that's not welcome in this legacy. Talk to me about that. Like, what are your
yeah.
thoughts? I know most Black queer people have thought about it. So
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
I have lots of thoughts and articles and all kinds of things that
Oh,
I've
really?
written
Okay.
on
Yeah.
this. So I think so. The short answer to your question is yes. One of the things that I say is that for the Black church to not be fully affirming of queer people is antithetical to the Black church's liberation theology roots.
Yeah.
Those two are at odds with each other.
Right.
I do think so. One of the things in my research that I take care to do is
Mhm.
not to paint the Black church with an extremely broad stroke.
That's good. Yeah.
And this is something that kind of gets me in trouble sometimes, but
Mhm.
hey, this is what we do.
Mhm. Mhm.
I am careful to say that the Black church, capital B, capital C, as an institution, is and has always been non affirming of queer people.
Mhm.
I do not say that the Black church institutionally is or has always been homophobic or transphobic.
Right.
Because throughout history,
Mhm.
the Black church has in some ways made space for queer people in really
Mhm.
particular ways, right? You can serve in the music ministry
Yes,
and we
indeed.
all know you gay, right?
Most
We
of the
don't
gay
care.
people were
I'm
in the
telling
music
you, as
industry. Yeah.
long as you get up there and sing real good and direct that choir, we
Come on
don't
now.
care who you sleeping with. Just, leave it at home. Don't bring it in here. But so there are these scripts and these rules that
Mhm.
and I mean
Mhm.
even pastors. I did a historical analysis of the Black church, and even notable prominent pastors who were
Mhm.
basically openly queer.
Mm.
And church was just kind of like, okay, we just not gonna talk about the fact that. bishop or
Yeah.
pastor or apostle so and so is 70 some years old, ain't never been married, but always got a younger
Hmm.
man that's
Come on
always
now.
real close. I
Talk
may or
about it.
may not have been that younger man for
Really?
some pastor, but we not. That's a whole nother. We ain't got time
Wow.
for that in this episode.
Right.
And I've seen it. It's like everybody knew that me and this person was, but it was like, okay, we
Wow.
just not gonna talk about
Wow.
it.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I argue that, the black church really didn't become super, super homophobic until the late 80s and the early 90s for a couple of reasons. One, the rise of the AIDS epidemic.
Hmm.
And two, there was a lot of political uh, stuff that happened on. So, Kathy Cohen's book on AIDS, The Boundary of Blackness, talks about
Hmm.
this really well. I mean, even recent books like Anthea Butler's book and talking about white evangelicalism, these two
Yeah.
kind of go hand in hand. Because as you mentioned, like this white evangelicalism is a big part of what we're seeing also in the black church. And so
Hmm.
you had this push in the late 80s and the early 90s for this super conservatism, this quote unquote moral majority. So we're just going to tackle all of these things from family structures. So we're going to attack single mothers with anti-blackness. We're going to attack welfare, anti-blackness. We're going to attack, so all of these things really are rooted in anti-blackness. And with that came this increase in homophobia and transphobia that
Hmm.
kind of took place in the 90s. And it also kind of involves, as Kathy Cohen's book talks about, these black church pastors taking money from the government, essentially the government being like, in these kind of political pundits, like, yeah, you all want grants? All right, well, maybe your grant will get approved if you kind of preach a more conservative theology.
Yeah. It's basically pimping, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
I love hearing that because you got receipts. You are an educated man. So, these are all thoughts that I've just kind of been thinking and I couldn't pinpoint time frames and things like that. So this is really helpful. A couple of questions came up in my mind, so I'm going to try to hold
sure.
them and ask them in order. So, can you talk to me a little bit more about the ways that white evangelicalism infiltrated black church in that time in the 80s and 90s? I mean, I was born in the 80s, right? Coming of age in the 90s. Um, and the most of the things I heard the black church talk about at that time were hip hop, yeah, and AIDS. And so, they were burn the tapes and all this stuff. So like, can you talk to me, like, how did that get in? Because when you say, I didn't know that there was a grant issue, but that makes me, that's a throwback to me about, plantation pastors preaching certain texts, right? So talk to me about that. Can you go a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah. So there's some of that that too, right? So it's like the uh I mean, it boils down to this belief that proximity to whiteness equates to success. And so wanting to be able to rub elbows with the right people, right? So the right people who can kind of help push your grant through or help you identify certain sources of funding or who can help you get a little bit of prestige, right? So thinking about who these churches are inviting to speak in their pulpits, right? Because we like to have
Mhm.
politicians come and speak, like
Indeed.
who is going to do uh,
Uh-huh.
those sorts of things. Yeah. I mean, in churches, operating as nonprofits, which I'm not knocking that. There's nothing
Right.
necessarily wrong with it. I think that churches can do really great things
Mhm.
with a registered nonprofit organization. But thinking about where they can pull money from, what organizations or political
Mhm.
folks they can pull money from, really by saying like, well, if you preach this conservative theology, we'll give you this money.
Right.
Um, and wanting to kind of align with I would just say they align with whiteness in such a way as to kind of rebuild the black family. It's respectability politics that we've seen all throughout
Mhm.
Reconstruction, all throughout Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement,
Mhm.
and you kind of see that resurgence that
Mhm.
happens again, largely in response to queer people. So the push for gay marriage really started in the early 90s, right? And so
Mhm.
you kind of have these gay marriage was one thing that conservatives actively opposed, and abortion was another a big one that came out around that time too, right? And so in order for white evangelicalism also merged with political conservatism. In order for them to win, they say we have to get some of these people on our side. Well,
Yeah.
if we can get really, really conservative Black folks and
Mm,
other folks of color on our
mm.
side, and we still see the remnants of this today, right?
Yes.
There are plenty. I argue that most
So,
Black Christian folks would be Republican if Republicans weren't so racist.
huh. Yeah. That's a
If they
whole.
denounced racism, so many Black folk, Latino folk, it, all kinds of folks of color would
Mm-hmm.
switch and become Republican.
Mm-hmm.
But what we see now, right, is after the, and I might be going ahead of your question, is post 90s into we get to the Obama era.
Uh-huh.
And well, it was really Joe Biden's fault when he kind of supported gay marriage while he
Right.
was vice president, which forced Barack Obama to then voice his support of gay marriage. And so then the Black church was like, well, now what do we do? Because we got the first Black president saying he supports gay marriage.
Mm-hmm.
We ain't really with that, but we can't lead a brother out there by himself. So
Mm-hmm.
what are we going to do?
Right.
So then I argue that you see the Black church kind of shift in that they are in favor of civil rights for queer people, but
Mm-hmm.
still view uh, same gender relations and transgender identities as wrong. So it'll say, like, we think it's wrong to discriminate against queer people. We
Right.
think that maybe they should have the right to marry. They should have, but we don't want to perform their marriages, right? Like, you can do what you want. It's more that live and let live kind of thing. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's kind of the era that we're in now, especially in the age of social media, where it has become unpopular to be outwardly homophobic because you end up on World Star Hip Hop and all these
Mm-hmm.
other sorts of things, and you get canceled. So people aren't being as openly homophobic these days.
Right.
It's more so we just not gonna talk about it.
Just not gonna talk about it. Yeah, we welcome everyone.
Oh
Okay,
yeah.
so okay, wait. Okay, oh man. Okay. So when you think about the words, actually, let me tell you this. So I never had the language for that, but that was my experience. So when I came out to my parents, I was actually outed. So I
Mm.
was like, well, let me go on and call them before, somebody else does. So, at first I was like, y'all can't be terribly surprised. But we talked through it and it was like, well, we don't agree, but we can't judge. And then I met with my bishop, and the bishop of the church that I went to after, like, this was a church that my parents started going to when I went to college. And so this bishop is amazing. They do amazing work. You should probably interview him for your stuff because he's incredible. And he sat across me. He was like, I don't agree, but I'm learning and willing to hear you. And I know you love God. And Luther, when I tell you that there was something that washed over me hearing this man say to me, like, I don't agree, but I know your heart and I know you love God. That was so affirming to me. So when you think about homophobia and transphobia, is there a difference between being like non-affirming and being transphobic or homophobic? Can you talk to me about the differences?
Yeah. Yes. And this is actually something that I'm still thinking through. Um, there's an organization in Chicago called Pride in the Pews. I'm not sure if
Hmm,
you've heard of them.
no.
Don Abram, who is
Okay.
the founder and executive director, wonderful, wonderful guy doing some really amazing work.
Mhm.
And they have this thing. They haven't published it yet. I'm waiting for them to publish it so I can cite them on it. But
Mm,
they've kind of created this idea and this notion of churches kind of being along a continuum from being just kind of like outright homophobic to being maybe some don't ask, don't tell, to
mm,
maybe accepting, to affirming, to advocacy. I think is maybe the last step. And that's how I kind of think of it, as like non affirming. You have accepting, affirming, and then advocating, because those are all three different things. And I
mhm,
do talk about that in some of my previously published work, in saying that the Black church is not monolithic in how um, it deals with sexuality and sexual orientation. Sure, the overwhelming majority are non-affirming, and that's the
mhm.
exact word that I use, is that
That's
they
perfect.
don't fully affirm queer people as being, whole, good.
Mhm,
But I think there are different levels, because some churches are outright like, you're nasty, you're wrong, you're going to hell. And then others that are like, well, we love everybody and we accept you. Now, we're not going to perform your wedding. You can't
mhm,
be ordained here. but you're welcome to come and nobody's gonna like bother you.
Mm-hmm.
To churches that, yeah, we accept everybody, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
then you have the kind of the next level of churches that will march in pride parades and you know, write letters to their elected officials on behalf of queer people, so that you kind of have like different
Yeah.
ways that churches engage with that. And I think it's important to understand those nuances too,
Yeah.
as I said earlier, not to just paint
Mm-hmm.
um, the Black church with such a broad brushstroke.
I'm gonna hit you with another question off of that. So, if you're a Black queer person,
Mm,
should you attend a church that does not advocate?
mm,
I don't even like the word should, but you know what I mean.
yeah, that is a tough question
Hmm.
because, and this is something that I have to tell my white uh, counterparts as well, my
Mm-hmm.
white queer counterparts as well, because that's always this question of, well, if you if your church is not affirming, just go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, they ain't really much other places to go.
Yes.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
That's exactly why I asked.
and so then it's like, do I just not go to church?
Mm-hmm.
Right, which is part of like my question for my dissertation, because I want to know, what are people doing. Some people choose just, you know what, I'm just not going to go. I'm just not
Mm-hmm.
going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Some people can decide to go to a church that's predominantly white, because the overwhelming majority of affirming spaces are predominantly white.
Mm-hmm.
um, and some people try those spaces and be like, I mean, it's affirming, but now I got to deal with racism.
Yes.
So now it's like, do I go to the Black church and deal with their non-affirmation, or do I go to this predominantly white church that's affirming and then have to deal with the racism? So it's almost kind of like a,
Whew.
I got to pick which oppression I want to deal with on Sundays.
Pick your poison, so to speak.
I'm telling you, right? And so
Yeah.
that's what makes this question difficult. I don't believe that that folks should go where they are being actively harmed.
Mm-hmm.
That is my personal opinion. When, if I'm ever
It's
talking to
beautiful way
someone
to
and
put it.
they're going in there, like, if they are actively harming you,
Mm-hmm.
um, leave. That
Mm-hmm.
would be my recommendation. But I understand it's not that easy,
Right.
because where else are you going to go? There's also like family issues, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're in some places, if you're raised in a family church and your whole family goes, and like,
Mm-hmm.
leaving the church is like leaving the family.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so there are always these layers to it. But I would always say, like, if you're somewhere where you are actively being harmed,
Mm-hmm.
uh, leave.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, other than that, there's some things to negotiate.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to think if I have any more questions. The reason I asked you that was because of, like, like white progressives and the experiences there and the ways that they think about how, like, if a place is not affirming, that you need to, that place, if that place is not outwardly advocating, it is not affirming. And hearing that a lot in white spaces and feeling like, yeah, I think it's a little different, like
Mm,
I feel, and I don't, that's why I asked you, like, I don't know if that's counterintuitive for me to be like, yeah, but like a Black church that's like not advocating, but they're affirming you, it's life-giving to be there. The pastor knows you, the people know you, they know your life, like, you don't have to hide in any way. Like, to me, that feels like, I think that can be okay, because this invisible institution that was birthed during, the beginning of America, it's like, it's more than church. It's like,
mhm,
it's more than Sunday morning. It is a whole network of community. And plus, there's all kinds of other affirmation taking place. I remember being told I was cute for the first time in church, being told I was smart for the first time in church, being told that I was called to preach. I mean, the bishop I was just telling you about called me to the altar one time and said, "You are anointed to preach and to teach truth," And so there are all kinds of other affirmations that take place in Black church that I feel like we can't necessarily use that white progressive lens to kind of determine whether or not a church is a safe space. But you're the one with the receipts and the PhD, so I'm just checking. Now, tell me about, like, so when you said the 90s and the 80s, do you have documentary, like, evidence of that stuff, like of the 501 situation and getting like donations if you say certain things. I mean, we know we've got documented evidence of that happening, in slave times. But
Hmm.
now, like with that, is there evidence of that?
That's a good question. I don't have those because I will admit I did not do the archival research on that. I just read other people's work who
Yeah,
did.
right. Yeah.
Um, but that would actually be a fascinating uh, project. And if someone out there is listening who wants to collaborate on such a project,
Eight.
that would be fascinating, right? To see if those documents exist and or to see how um, churches and parachurch and political
Oh yeah,
organizations try to cover that up, maybe. So yeah, to go over that with a magnifying glass would be interesting.
it would be. All right, so I'm gonna have you back. I have a whole lot of different seasons in mind, and they're all topical. So I'm like those 3 seasons especially. So we keep our seasons and our episodes short because we want people to stay with us. So I'm going to ask
Absolutely.
you the last 3 questions that I ask everyone, and please take your time because you're brilliant and very clear, and I think that this has been really helpful for folks. So what are you bringing with you from the
Yes.
rubble? Was there anything worth keeping from the faith that might have collapsed for you when you started walking in truth? Um, the second question is, what are you binging? Something you watch on Netflix or something like that. Um, and then, what are some words for us to live by? And I would love for you to speak to the audience at that
Mhm.
point.
Yeah,
That's okay. So, whatever order you
sure.
want to do, go for it.
For sure. What am I bringing from the rubble? Um, I made a note to myself because I didn't want to forget when you asked me
Mm.
earlier. A felt spirituality.
Oh yeah.
Um, we used to always say, I used to hear in church, I wouldn't serve a God I couldn't feel. Right? And so it really is about that feeling. And that's something that, growing up in the Pentecostal church, it was all a feeling. I mean,
Mhm,
everything was a feeling. We didn't Nothing was scripted. Everything was extemporaneous.
mhm.
And I realized when I got to seminary that not everybody's a church like that. Um, there are churches that everything from the top to the bottom is written out
Oh
and
yeah.
printed. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh,
You get 5 minutes for certain things, and
oh,
you better not go over.
I'm telling you. Oh, the
Yeah.
prayer is 2 lines. Oh,
I'm like, "It is short up in here. I got
this
time
is
for lunch."
new. We out in 50 minutes. I'm telling you.
Shut.
But so everything was extemporaneous. I mean,
Mhm,
nothing was planned. We didn't play any of the music. Somebody just got up and started singing, and that was how it went. But it
mhm,
was all about a feeling and how
mhm,
everything just kind of moved and connected. And that is something that I am taking with me, no matter what space I'm in, whether I'm in a
mhm,
predominantly Black space, Pentecostal space,
mhm.
Episcopalian space, Catholic space. I want a spirituality that I can feel,
Come on.
and if I can't feel it, I don't want to be there.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and so like that is something that I'm definitely taking with me and learning how to incorporate into the various spaces that I am
mhm,
in.
mhm, mm.
What am I binging? Right now, I've been binging that old TV show 24.
Oh,
Uh,
yes! With Jack. What's his last name? Jack
Bauer.
Jack
Mhm.
Bauer, bruh.
That's it.
Yes, I was obsessed with 24 back in like 2008 and 9, bruh. Yes, I
I
love
have
that
brought it
show.
back.
You have? Oh my gosh. Wow. Oh
So
man,
that's been
that's
great. I basically only watch crime dramas and medical dramas. Those are like the only
oh
two
cool.
genres of TV I watch, and then the occasional HGTV and Food Network. But
Nice.
that's usually when I'm in a hotel. Like if I'm traveling in a
Yeah,
hotel,
yeah.
HGTV. I like to see the people.
Mhm.
I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I'm a freelance basket weaver, and our budget is $8.6 million.
Right.
And I'm just like, what are them baskets made out of?
Indeed.
So
Can I get a basket? I mean, a gift in kind.
telling you, shoot, I don't even need that big a house. And so, words to live by. Um, One of the things that I always say is belief is a choice.
Mm. Mhm.
Belief is a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is something that I have had to learn, especially growing up in a space where there's so much indoctrination to where you don't really feel like you have a choice of what to believe. It's like, this is it. You
Mm-hmm.
either believe it or you go into hell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's no conversation. Well, I mean, there allegedly is conversation. You know, we say Bible study where we talk about it, but basically it's just us reinforcing that this is what you're supposed to believe.
Right.
But belief is a choice. We can choose what we want to believe, and our belief can evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they
Mm-hmm.
should evolve. We like to bring up this scripture of "I am the Lord, I change not." Uh, sure, God does not change. The essence of who God is does not change, but
Indeed.
our understanding of God most certainly should. As our
Mm-hmm.
circumstances change, how we encounter God, how we engage with God should change, right? People in, the 12th century prophets
Mm-hmm.
didn't pray for traveling grace and mercy as they go down the dangerous highways and byways so their car
Mm.
wouldn't flip up because they didn't have no car, right? But
Exactly.
we
Right.
we do. So now we have
Yeah.
certain things that our
Indeed.
understanding of God as a protector, a hedge of protection, is a little bit different
Mm-hmm.
now because we're not worrying about whether our donkey's knees are gonna buckle. Um,
Come
so
on, somebody.
our understanding of who God is and how we encounter God does change, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that does cause us to reevaluate. The entire point of the New Testament in Jesus Christ is to bring a new understanding of how we encounter God. Jesus said, "I did not come to do away with the law,
Mm-hmm.
but to fulfill it." Right. So that this is a new way of doing it. This is how this had to work in the past because that's how the world was. That's how things operated. There were 12 tribes, and so we had to do things this way. Now that
Right.
we're in this new era, we have to adapt. And what
Yes.
those laws meant for those people have to change. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what Jesus did. But we just think that, Jesus came, Jesus died, and then the story just kind of, well, then Paul, because we love Paul. But after
Mm.
Paul, the story just kind of stops.
Yeah.
And it's like, so God ain't been talking since
Since first
first
grade.
century. God just stopped. God just went on mute for the
God
past
dropped the
2,000 years.
mic in the first century.
I'm
Yeah.
telling you, that's it.
Right.
And so belief is a choice, and our beliefs should evolve. So I encourage all of us to choose to embrace beliefs and theologies that center liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, Jesus came to set us free in
Indeed.
every sense of the word. And so choose to believe that which will set you free.
Come on. Listen, this has been really, really rich. And I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing because the I can't imagine what will happen when educated Black queer theologians begin to not only speak to but begin to lead in the church, because of the embodiment and the wrestling that takes place. There's such richness just in what you say. And every person that I've met, especially Black queer people, the depth, right? Like it doesn't matter who you're speaking with, the depth, the nuance, the articulation. I just think that is something that is so beautiful. And I'm excited to see what happens as more and more of us kind of rise up and begin to speak. So thank you for your work. I cannot wait to read what you come out with. And I'm definitely going to have you back. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Where can people find you?
My handle, Luther Young, on all social media platforms. So I'm on Instagram, Twitter. I'm on Facebook. You can just search my name, Luther Young or Reverend Luther Young Jr. Yeah, I'm around.
Thank you, Rev.
Oh,
Well,
LutherYoung.com. Yes, LutherYoung.com. Also
LutherYoung.com.
forgot that
Okay.
one. Yeah,
All right.
so
Bet.
that
And they can probably get all the other handles on there, I'm sure. Okay.
absolutely.
LutherYoung.com. Thank you so much for being on the
Thank you,
show.
Tamis.
Alrighty. All right.
Thank you for listening. To put your money in your heart is donate to Subculture Inc. and clear the path for Black students today.